What happens when a movement built on peace accidentally creates one of the hottest markets of the decade? Welcome to Bear Markets and Bad Decisions, where history keeps reminding us that human behavior doesn't change. It just gets better branding. Today, we're heading back to 1967, San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Cue the soundtrack. Jefferson Airplane drifting out of open windows, the Grateful Dead playing for free in the park, and Janis Joplin sounding like she's personally carrying the emotional weight of an entire generation. Tie-dye everywhere, flowers in hair, acid in pockets, peace signs drawn with the confidence of people who truly believed you could opt out of the system. It was called the Summer of Love, a mass experiment in living differently. No war, no greed, no rigid hierarchies, just community, music, and good vibes. And for a moment, it worked. But here's the part the mythology tends to skip. Utopias still need food. They still need housing. They still need bathrooms. And when tens of thousands of idealistic people show up in the same neighborhood chanting "share everything," the math starts asking some very uncomfortable questions. Today, we're talking about the summer peace and love went viral, and how belief itself became a currency. Act 1. The Dream. When belief became a currency. To understand the summer of love, you have to understand the mood first. By the mid-1960s, a lot of young Americans were done. Done with Vietnam, done with rigid careers, done with their parents' idea of success, which seemed to involve quiet misery and matching furniture. So when a rumor started spreading that there was a place where people were living differently, sharing food, sharing space, sharing love, sharing ideas, it hit like a dopamine rush. The place was Haight-Ashbury. And it wasn't just geography, it was atmosphere. The soundtrack mattered. Jefferson Airplane wasn't just background noise. It was a manifesto set to guitar. The Grateful Dead weren't performing so much as existing loudly in public. And Janis Joplin sounded like someone took the collective anxiety of a generation, lit it on fire, and handed it a microphone. This wasn't entertainment, it was proof. Proof that you could live outside the script. Proof that community could replace hierarchy. Proof that vibes apparently were enough. And belief is powerful like that. Belief pulls people in before money ever does. You didn't come to hate because you had a business plan. You came because you heard something was happening, something meaningful, something alive, something you didn't want to miss. And when enough people believe that at the same time, something interesting happens. Belief turns into demand. Not consciously, not cynically, just mechanically. If 10 people believe in a place, that's a hangout. If 1,000 people believe, it's a movement. If tens of thousands of people believe, it's an economy. Suddenly, the idea of free love and shared space needs beds, and food, and places to sit, and places to sleep, and places to exist indoors when San Francisco remembers it's foggy and cold. None of that feels like capitalism when you arrive. It just feels like logistics. People brought cash because they needed to eat. They paid for rooms because they needed shelter. They bought posters and records because belief likes souvenirs. And here's the key thing. No one showed up thinking they were customers. They thought they were participants. That distinction matters because participants don't price shop the same way customers do. They're not comparing alternatives. They're not thinking in spreadsheets. They're thinking in meaning. If this place represents who you are, or who you want to be, you don't ask whether the price makes sense. You ask whether missing out would feel worse. And that's how belief quietly becomes currency. Not because anyone planned it, but because human beings always attach value to belonging. By the time the summer of love really kicked off, Haight-Ashbury wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an idea with momentum. And ideas with momentum attract attention, not just from dreamers, but from people who know how to convert attention to income. At this stage, no one's the villain yet. This is the dream phase. The moment where everyone thinks they're building something together. The problem is that belief scales faster than infrastructure, and the math always notices first. Act 2. The market forms, what people came for and what they got. Most people didn't come to Haight looking for profit. They came looking for relief. They wanted community instead of competition, connection instead of careers, meaning instead of milestones. They wanted to wake up surrounded by people who shared food, shared space, shared ideas, where nobody cared what your parents did or what your 5-year plan looked like. They wanted music on the streets, conversations that mattered, and the feeling that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They wanted life, not a ladder. And at first, that's what it felt like. You arrived and someone handed you a flower. A stranger invited you to sit down. There was food in a communal pot, music everywhere, psychedelics aplenty. No one asked what you did for a living. It felt like opting out had finally worked. But then, reality started sneaking in through the side door. Because belief is powerful, but it's also loud. And once word spread, the crowds didn't trickle in. They flooded. Busloads, hitchhikers, tourists, seekers, people with backpacks, guitars, and just enough cash to get by for a week or two. Suddenly, everything people thought was abundant became scarce. Beds were the first to go. What had been a couch or a spare floor turned into a full house overnight. Rooms that once felt communal now had sign-up sheets, then waiting lists, then prices. Not because people wanted to charge, but because demand doesn't ask permission. Food was next. Communal kitchens that were supposed to feed everyone started asking for donations, not optional ones. The kind where you realize very quickly what happens if you don't contribute. Meals got smaller, lines got longer, and suddenly, the dream of shared abundance started coming with conditions. Even space itself became contested. Parks filled up. Sidewalks became bedrooms. Privacy disappeared. Bathrooms were scarce. Tempers shortened. The experience people wanted, ease, connection, freedom, got replaced with something much less poetic, logistics. And that's where the quiet shift happened. Because the people arriving still wanted the idea of the summer of love, but what they were living inside was a rapidly forming market. Landlords noticed first. A spare room wasn't a kindness anymore, it was inventory. A crowded Victorian wasn't a shared home, it was a high-demand asset. Rents rose quickly and not subtly. The logic was simple. If someone else is willing to pay, why shouldn't I take it? Merchants followed. Posters, clothes, jewelry, incense, experiences. Everything that symbolized the movement suddenly had a price tag, and not a modest one. People weren't just buying stuff, they were buying proof that they belonged. And the people who came chasing freedom found themselves doing math again. How many nights can I afford to stay? How many meals can I skip? How long before I have to leave? What they wanted was a place to exist without pressure. What they experienced was pressure in a new costume. Not corporate, not suit and tie, but still very real. And here's the part that matters. No one orchestrated this. There wasn't a master plan to exploit idealists. This is just what happens when demand explodes and supply can't keep up. Even when everyone has good intentions, belief brought people together. Crowds created scarcity. Scarcity created prices. And prices don't care why you showed up. By the time the summer of love was in full swing, Haight-Ashbury had become two things at once. A place where people were genuinely trying to live differently, and a place where the cost of belonging was rising faster than anyone had expected. The experience people wanted was community without competition. The experience they got was a market they didn't realize they'd entered until it started charging admission. And once that line is crossed, the dream doesn't end immediately, but it does change. Act 3. The winners and the losers. Who cashed in and who paid. By the time the summer of love reached its peak, something uncomfortable had become obvious, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Not everyone was having the same summer. Some people were thriving, others were barely holding on. And the difference wasn't who believed harder, loved more freely, or committed more fully to the cause. It was who controlled scarce things. Housing, space, access, timing. The winners weren't the ones who showed up with guitars and dreams. They were the ones who already owned something people needed when the crowds arrived. Capital is always king. Landlords were the clearest example. If you owned a building in Haight-Ashbury before the summer of love, you didn't need to understand a movement. You didn't need to believe in peace or free love. You just needed to understand demand. A room that once housed a friend now housed 3 strangers. A couch turned into a nightly rental. Floors filled up. Prices rose, not because of greed in the abstract, but because scarcity finally had leverage. And scarcity always finds its voice. Merchants figured it out too. Selling a tie-dye shirt wasn't about fabric, it was about identity. A poster wasn't decoration, it was proof you'd been there. Jewelry, incense, records, handmade anything. It all became shorthand for belonging. And people paid, not because they were stupid, because when something represents who you are, price becomes secondary. The people who arrived early, whether they meant to or not, were positioned perfectly. They owned property. They had storefronts. They had connections. They understood how to turn attention into income. The people who arrived late, the ones who believed just as deeply, paid higher prices for worse conditions. And that gap widened fast. Because every new wave of arrivals didn't just add energy, it added competition. Competition for beds, competition for food, competition for space. The movement promised equality, but the market quietly sorted everyone anyway. Those with assets captured value. Those without absorbed cost. And here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. A lot of the winners weren't hippies at all. They weren't idealists. They weren't revolutionaries. They were owners. Some were curious locals. Some were opportunists. Some were investors who recognized a trend before it had a name. They didn't need to love the music. They didn't need to understand the ideology. They just needed to know that thousands of people were willing to show up and pay, even if they didn't realize they were paying. Meanwhile, the people who came chasing freedom found themselves making compromises they never planned on, skipping meals, sleeping rough, living in overcrowded, unstable conditions. The cost of staying rose steadily, not in one dramatic spike, but in dozens of small decisions that slowly drained people's energy and money. And that's how inequality sneaks into movements that swear they're immune to it. Not through betrayal, through structure. Because belief brings people together, but ownership determines who benefits. The summer of love didn't fail because people stopped caring. It strained because the economics underneath it sorted people faster than the ideals could keep up. Those who controlled supply did well. Those who brought demand paid the difference. And by the time anyone could clearly see the imbalance, it was already baked in. The dream hadn't collapsed yet, but it had tilted. And once a movement tilts, the people carrying the most weight feel it first. Act 4. The Collapse. Why Vibes Don't Scale. By late summer of 1967, the summer of love hadn't exploded, it sagged. The dream didn't end in a dramatic fireball. It wore down, slowly, quietly, exhaustingly. Haight-Ashbury was overwhelmed. There were too many people and not enough everything. Too few beds, too few bathrooms, too little food, too little medical care, trash piled up, parks turned into makeshift bedrooms, privacy disappeared, tensions rose. What had felt like freedom started to feel like friction. And here's the key point. None of this was caused by bad intentions. It was caused by scale. The Summer of Love was designed for a few thousand people experimenting with community. It was never built for tens of thousands showing up at once. No systems, no infrastructure, no governance. No way to allocate resources fairly when demand outpaced supply. Vibes are excellent at attracting people. They are terrible at coordinating them. Communes that once functioned on trust and goodwill started breaking down. Shared meals became rationed. Decisions became contentious. Someone always felt like they were contributing more than they were getting back. When resources are abundant, generosity feels effortless. When resources are scarce, generosity turns into accounting. Health issues multiplied. Drug overdoses increased. Sanitation problems became public health problems. Volunteers burned out. People who came seeking connection found themselves overwhelmed, sick, or simply tired. And the thing no one likes to admit, a lot of people left. Not because they stopped believing in peace and love, but because they couldn't live inside the chaos anymore. The remaining population skewed younger, poorer, and more vulnerable. People with money, options, or homes elsewhere quietly exited. The dream concentrated its cost among those least able to absorb them. That's how collapses actually happen. Not when belief disappears, but when endurance does. The Summer of Love didn't fail morally. It failed operationally. There was no plan for growth, no mechanism for maintenance, no way to manage success. And success was the problem. The movement proved its own appeal and then collapsed under the weight of it. By the end of 1967, city officials stepped in, not gently, not philosophically, practically. Clinics were set up. Services were added. The neighborhood was cleared. The moment was declared over. The death of the hippie ceremony wasn't a rejection of ideals. It was an acknowledgement that the experiment had reached its limits. And here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. You can build a movement on belief. You can build a culture on vibes. But you cannot sustain a society without systems. The Summer of Love showed the world what was possible, and just as importantly, what was missing. It proved that people wanted something different. It just didn't prove how to keep it running. And when systems fail, the costs don't fall evenly. They fall hardest on the people who stayed the longest. Act 5. When a generation tries to opt out. When the Summer of Love collapsed, it didn't disappear because people stopped wanting something better. It disappeared because wanting something better isn't the same as building something that works. That's the part of this story that matters now. Because the feeling that drove people to Haight-Ashbury in 1967 didn't vanish with tie-dye and vinyl records. It shows up every time a generation looks around and realizes the system they were promised doesn't line up with the lives they're living. That's where a lot of people are today, especially younger ones. Gen Z didn't wake up one morning and decide they hated work, ownership, or the economy. They ran the numbers, sometimes literally, sometimes just intuitively, and realized the math wasn't adding up. Do everything right, get educated, work full-time, still can't afford housing, still can't build savings, still can't imagine a stable future. That's not ideology, that's experience. And when people stop believing the system will ever work for them, they don't start with policy proposals. They start with escape. In the 1960s, escape looked physical. You moved into a neighborhood. You joined a commune. You tried to live outside the system altogether. Today, escape looks different. But the impulse is the same. It looks like questioning whether ownership is worth it. It looks like rejecting traditional career ladders. It looks like mutual aid instead of institutions. It looks like dark humor about burning it down, because imagining reform feels exhausting. Just like the hippies, a lot of people today aren't trying to destroy anything. They're trying to breathe. And history is sympathetic to that. What history is less forgiving about is what happens next. Because opting out feels powerful in the short term, but it doesn't build infrastructure. It doesn't solve allocation. It doesn't answer who maintains systems when they scale. The Summer of Love proved the belief can bring people together faster than anything else. It also proved that belief alone doesn't distribute resources fairly, keep people housed, or sustain communities over time. That doesn't mean the dream was wrong. It means the follow-through was missing. The real lesson of the Summer of Love isn't don't dream or don't question the system. It's this. Systems don't get replaced by vibes. They get replaced by better systems. And better systems are boring. They require planning, incentives, trade-offs, maintenance, math. The very thing people are often trying to escape when they feel fed up in the first place. Every generation that feels locked out goes through this phase. First comes disillusionment, then comes experimentation, then comes the hard part, deciding whether to build something durable or just reject what exists. The hippies showed us what happens when a movement gets stuck in the second phase. They changed culture. They changed art. They changed how people thought about freedom and community, but they didn't change how societies actually function at scale. And that's okay, as long as we learn from it, because the frustration people feel today isn't a failure of character or effort, it's a signal. The same kind of signal the Summer of Love was sending, just in a different key. The question isn't whether the feeling is valid. It is. The question is what comes after the feeling. Because history is very clear about one thing. Opting out is a phase. Sustainable change only happens when someone stays long enough to do the unglamorous work of making the math work again. And that's it for today. Turns out peace and love are powerful, but they don't replace plumbing, planning, or a spreadsheet or two. I'm Heather Shell, and you've been listening to Bear Markets and Bad Decisions. If this episode made you think, laugh, or question a few things, do me a favor. Follow the show, leave a review, or share it with a friend who would definitely survive a 1967 commune for about 12 minutes. Until next week, groovy people, stay curious, stay kind, and try not to build a utopia without a budget.